It is not a war, it is a massacre. Another humanitarian catastrophe being played out in Syria's eastern Ghouta, just 10 kilometres from the capital, Damascus. More than 500 civilians, it has been estimated, have been killed after days of recent bombardment by regime forces, a move that has left some aid organisations, quote, lost for words. A humanitarian corridor, as they describe it, is now in place, but the question is it simply too little? Is it also too late?
Chaos in Syria once again, this time eastern Ghouta, one of the last rebel strongholds bombed into submission.
Eastern Ghouta cannot wait. It's high time to stop this hell on earth.
The UN ceasefire lasted less than a day. Will the international community intervene in time? Eastern Ghouta has been under siege since 2013 by Russian and Iranian-backed Syrian forces. Since fighting escalated this month, the death toll has risen to more than 500 civilians. 2,500 people have been wounded, including children. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights says at least 120 children have been killed. Hospitals have been destroyed by missiles, and according to recent reports, chemicals have been used in attacks. Bombed and besieged, will there be an end to the violence? The UN has stepped in. After much deliberation, a ceasefire was agreed, allowing 30 days for humanitarian relief. But Russia was accused of stalling negotiations.
While we have been arguing over commas, Assad's planes have been killing more civilians in their homes and in their hospitals.
But despite UN efforts, the ceasefire fell apart in under a day. And it's not the first time. The last ceasefire in 2016 in Aleppo also lasted less than 24 hours.
هاي الهدنة كلها حكي فاضي لأني كلهم كذابين ونظام فاسد وروسيا لسه أفسد منه. حكوا في هدنة قبل هالمرة وعملوا هدنة وخلوا فيها وأكيد رح يخلوا فيها مرة تانية.
In Ghouta, Russia and Syria are blaming the opposition for fueling the current conflict.
Ситуация в Восточной Ghouте несут ответственность те, кто поддерживают террористов.
And while the blame game goes on, nearly 500,000 people have died in the Syrian war.
7 years of failure to stop the violence. 7 years of unremitting and frightful mass killing.
Russia's President Vladimir Putin has now ordered a daily ceasefire of 5 hours to help trapped civilians. But will this lead to a permanent halt in hostilities? As the protracted negotiations continue, how many more bombs will be dropped on eastern Ghouta? And will the reported use of chemical weapons escalate if the ceasefire fails? This is not the first time the UN has failed to enforce peace in Syria, which leaves critics wondering if a resolution will ever be respected.
With me at the round table today we have Walid Safour, President of the Syrian Human Rights Committee. We have Khulud Helmi, journalist and co-founder of Enab Baladi, which is an independent Syrian newspaper. We have Dr. Abdul Karim Egzayez, an Academy Fellow at the Centre on Global Health Security, which is part of Chatham House, and Amar Wakaf, supporter of the Assad regime and founder and director of the think tank Knossos. Thank you very much, all of you, for coming in. Amar Wakaf, let me ask you this first of all. If I walked into eastern Ghouta today, if I were at all able to do so, what do you think I would find?
Well, you'd find shells, you'd find a lot of carnage, I suppose, unfortunately, but equally so if you walk into Damascus, proper Damascus. It's suffering also from a lot of shelling, and a lot of people are getting killed, and the livelihood of the people have stopped as well.
Would I find the broken bodies of babies? Would I find the rubble of hospitals, 5 reduced to the ground in the last 5 days? Would I find pregnant women, their corpses of pregnant women? Would I smell chlorine? Would I detect sarin gas?
Well, you would find that people have stopped sending their children to school because there were casualties. You would find the Red Crescent hospitals being bombed or centers being bombed as well. There is, you know, obviously the government has a lot more firepower along with the Russians, but then the other side also isn't sitting still at all.
And if, as reported in today's Times, I met Abu Syria, who had 3 children, all of them presumed dead in the latest bombardment, one of whom was pulled alive but brain damaged eventually from the wreckage. A picture of the child there. Who should I blame for this?
Well, let me tell you who you should blame. Just before coming to the studio, there was a letter issued to the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres by some rebel fighters in eastern Ghouta, stating their willingness to kick out Al-Qaeda from that part of the country, saying that just give us 15 days and we'll do it for you. They probably should have done so 7 years ago.
A war is a terrible thing in anybody's lives. Is it right to lay all of the blame for this at the president of Syria's door?
It is apparent that who is to blame and responsible for the massacres, genocide, and crimes against humanity is the Russian-Iranian regime alliance, and this is going on for 7 years without a stop. It is clear that it's a war to crush the demand for freedom, democracy, and dignity of the Syrian people who are under their dictatorship for 50 years now.
But unfortunately, a long time ago, it ceased being about democracy in Syria, and it became a battleground for competing interests. And my point is it right to lay all of the blame for this at President Assad's door, or are those who've taken on their causes or taken their causes to the ground in Syria also very much to blame for what we're seeing?
You know, the demand of the Syrian people was peaceful, 100% at the beginning. But the Syrian regime converted it into violence. And from the first day, he spoke about violence and about extremism, about terrorism, about Islamic militantism, about Palestinian terrorists, about many, many things. And he converted. He obliged the people for self-defense.
Boris Johnson, the UK Foreign Secretary, said today that if chemical weapons were found to have been used in eastern Ghouta, it could be elsewhere in Syria, then the UK should launch some kind of attack. Given what's happened in the past,
like
they
used chemical weapons first of all in Al-Hula and Homs, like it was like back to 2012, even before Eastern Ghouta, and no one has taken anything since that time. Like we have been hearing and seeing our people being killed and suffocating because of the chemical weapons.
No, but do you think anything would happen at all?
Never, nothing.
Because we're talking about chlorine perhaps last week?
Yes,
yeah.
2 days before.
2 days before.
Sarin
in
Shifuniya earlier on?
Yeah, and then nothing's gonna happen because since the very first time when Assad has used the chemical weapons, in 2012 in Ghouta, when masses were killed, suffocated, I thought that the UN could take any stance, maybe just like set him accountable for all these things, but nothing has happened. And this gave him the green light to commit more and more atrocities since then, and no one is going to stop him because no one wants to.
Do you believe that the president of Syria feels more able to use them because nothing is happening when he does?
Well, first of all, we're taking for granted that he's using chemical weapons.
Well, I think the sarin attack in Ghouta was one of those that was actually established beyond doubt.
Well, that particular attack, when it happened, there were UN inspectors in Damascus, having gone there after 5 months of asking, going to investigate a chemical attack in Khan al-Assal, southwest of Aleppo, where Syrian army was attacked. We know that the other party has chemical weapons. Jaish al-Islam, part of current Eastern Ghouta setup, used chlorine gas also in Aleppo against Sheikh Maqsood. Everybody can have access to chemical weapons.
So are you suggesting that last week's chlorine attack was when bombs were being dropped by forces loyal to the president you support? You think they could well have been deliberately let off by people in that area.
If I could bring you the point of view of people of Damascus or people who support the government in general, why would you use chemical weapons so that some people have breathing, a few people have some breathing difficulties, where you could throw in a hand grenade and kill 5?
Yep, there are particularly 2 militant groups in that area, both of which say they want to, if they're successful, introduce Sharia law. Now, is that something that you think is worth fighting for?
Actually, before analyzing the military groups in eastern Ghouta, we need to analyze the civil society there, because, you know, sometimes the media or the reports focus on what they want to hear, which is something related to extremism or something related to terrorists, because it is the excuses that the regime...
Well, give us your benefit of analysis then.
So I think in eastern Ghouta there are a whole set of civil society organizations and a whole set of community who wants to live there and to establish their own community. And all the recent offensive were targeting mostly civilians and civilian infrastructure. And just in one day, in 20th of February, there was a report by the International Peace Movement that at least 110 civilians were killed using all different types of weapons. And in the same day, 8 hospitals, 8 health facilities went out of service. And I can name these health facilities. In the same day as well, the Syrian American Medical Society, they reported that their hospital in Erbil...
Mr. Wakaf, that makes the point that some of this sabotage, or could have been sabotage deliberately by those people who have a cause to push in terms of sort of bringing down the government. I mean, is it at all feasible in your mind that hospitals would have been blown up, that civilians would have been killed, to support that idea?
Actually, in my analysis, the targeting civilian infrastructures and especially health facilities is part of a strategy by the Syrian regime and its allies to first weaken the resilience of the community, so they feel more prone to flee their homes and to evacuate their area. And there is precedent to believe that this is the strategy. There are many examples since February 2012. The same scenario happened in Baba Amr neighborhood in Homs, and the same scenario happened again and again in Zabadani and Madaya, and then in eastern Aleppo, where 3,000 people were evacuated from eastern Aleppo. So it's kind of the same strategy: destroy all civilian infrastructures, focusing on health facilities. The community will feel more weakened, so they cannot stay in their homes.
And is this happening, do you think? Is the community feeling weakened?
Yes, of course. The aim of the Syrian regime is to weaken the morale of the Syrian people and to push them outside their place of residence, and to push them. Now they have opened what they call a human corridor, but this is not a human corridor. This is a corridor in order to push them out of their birthplace, in order to replace them. It is an ethnic cleansing. It is a demographical replacement.
You don't blame the people there for wanting to get out, though, do you? If they have an opportunity.
I'm not blaming the people, but I'm blaming the people who are perpetrating these aerial strikes and raids coming from the Syrian regime and coming from its supporters, the Russian Air Force. This is what I'm blaming for. And all the independent groups which investigated in Syrian cases, like the Independent Committee from the United Nations and others, said that the Syrian regime and its supporters are the main responsible for the gross violations, for the genocide, for the crime of war.
With respect, sir, we have heard these arguments, unfortunately, on and off for 7 years. What we're trying to establish is, when it comes to this suburb of Damascus, if you want to call it that, was there more that could have been done? Is what's being done at the moment going to help at all, or are we going to see, and let me put this to you, a capitulation which will inevitably see Assad's forces win?
They are winning over the people because they are using mass destruction weapons, and they are using the demographic change and ethnic cleansing to clear Damascus and Damascus suburb from the rebels or the people who revolted against the regime. Like in 2011, we were utterly peaceful movement to bring change to the Syrian people, but then we were immediately faced with force and violence. And then talking about myself coming from Daraya, in 2012, we were all pushed out of my hometown. And then we become IDPs, and then now I am a refugee in Turkey, and I have no access back to my home because I can't go back to Syria. The regime is going to...
When you say it's winning, do you think it will win?
It's winning, like it will. Like now, I mean, the force is in the hand of the regime because they are killing the people. Who's going to resist later on?
So what sort of Syria will there be after this if the president remains in power? What do you think will happen? I mean, given the atrocities that have been committed, whether you think they are mainly by one side or perhaps by disparate groups, it's going to take a long time to rebuild any kind of society. It is a different country.
Well, I'm going to answer your question by hoping to qualify some of the arguments that have been said or played out. In eastern Aleppo, before eastern Aleppo became part of Aleppo and Syria again, there were about like 300,000 people. When it capitulated because of the pressure, because of the military operation and what have you, 30,000 militants and their families left. And that tells you, providing that the numbers are okay, and I'm using Staffan de Mistura numbers here, 9 out of 10, including the famous Umran Daqnish, by the way, the kid pictured in the back of a ambulance, stunned. They chose to keep with the government. They stayed as they are. But what happened was that they got their livelihood back, electricity back, sanitation back, education back, life back. And now the rubble is gone in eastern Aleppo 1 year and a half afterwards.
But isn't that rather like saying, I will take everything away from you, and then you will be grateful when I give you something small back in return?
This is about countering the argument of demographic change. It is the same people who are still there. In fact, there were some people who fled eastern Aleppo when the militants came and actually came back to their countries. No people from Iraq or Iran ever went to eastern Aleppo.
Yeah, I'll ask you to respond in just a moment because I can see you visibly disagreeing, but I've got to come back to you because you haven't had a chance to say anything for a little while.
So actually, I just doubt that the same people, they return to these places in northwest Syria and Idlib province, where NGOs, international NGOs and local NGOs, they received people coming out from Aleppo. They documented at least 100,000 people coming out of Aleppo, and none of these people were able or think of going back, and most of them are
who's in eastern Aleppo now?
The military.
Well, that's where you were.
Well, who's in eastern Aleppo now?
Yes,
it's the people of eastern Aleppo.
Yes, Aleppo has like a population of 2 million or 3 million people. So for sure, if like a group of people, they left their homes and they were not allowed to go back, yes, there are few people, they stayed there.
Few?
Please. I don't want this to be about the civil war in general. I want it to be about specifically the area that we're talking about. And I'll get back to you in just a second because we have to move on through this. Walid, you were shaking your head as Wakaf was making his point. What would you like to say? And do you agree that the war is now unwinnable from an opposition point of view?
You know, it is a very complicated issue and a very complicated equation. Now, the Syrian regime is just a minor actor on the ground. The major actors are the Russian Air Force and the Americans. This is to take into consideration, and there is on one point coordination between them, and on the other a struggle for interest. The Russians are looking for air bases and for coastal Navy bases and for anything. The Americans are looking for the petroleum and the other minerals in the east, and each of them have got their own proxy. The Syrian people are crushed inside, and the Syrian regime is helping in this crushing and this killing on the side. He sold himself to the Russians, who supported him when he is about to fall in 2015, and he sold himself to the Iranian when he was about to fall in 2013 as well.
I know. If I'd been having this conversation with you 5 years ago, you would have thought that the Syrian opposition forces, which were relatively cohesive at that particular time, might have put up a reasonable fight. Now they are totally fragmented. You might have thought that there was no chance of President Assad remaining in power. Now I think, unfortunately from your point of view, the tide has turned. He will remain in power, will he not?
Temporarily, he will remain, but not forever, for a couple of years or so, because he is a losing card to all major players in the scene. The Russians dislike him, but they loved him because he is very sincere for them because he is selling himself to them. He is selling his existence to them. Without the Russian support, he will not remain 24 hours.
Let me put a point to you that I put to you, and you skirted it, but it wasn't controversial. Two of the main opposition groups in eastern Ghouta are said to want to introduce Sharia law should they be successful in their fight. In a country that was previously as secular as Syria, where do you think something like that might lead?
I mean, calling for Sharia law or Sharia prevalence. I mean, this is
if they were to be successful and if they were to impose it.
They will never do this because we're not going to allow them to do this.
But who's we in that sense?
I mean, the way is that the people, I mean, the local actors, I mean, the civil society, us who had our say in the very beginning, but then...
But isn't this the problem, that you had your say in the beginning? It was relatively peaceful. I remember covering it as a journalist. I remember looking at it and thinking, well, this is interesting. And then it got nasty. And then those people with the big guns, those people with the gas, those people with the bombs came in and changed your argument. And if this group of people win, then you're going to find you say, well, I don't really like that, but you're powerless.
But they're not going to rule. I mean, if they win the battle military, but they're not going to rule. If they rule, they have a share. But I mean, I don't, who says, like, I don't agree Assad stays and he is the one who pushed me out of my country. He's the one who enjailed my brother and all my friends and killed the millions in the streets. There's nothing going to be a justice if he stays. And then we are all just like devastated and then out of the country. And then if he stays, like, what if I stay a Syrian citizen? Why? And then he is the one who is committing all these atrocities, and now I have to negotiate if Sharia law is going to prevail. We're not going to allow this. I mean, the Syrians are not extremists, and the Assad is the one who pushed us to be extremists. Go back to 2011 when he freed Saidnaya prison from all these extremists, and then he sent them back to Idlib and Aleppo, and they are the ones who established ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Why? Why 2011, beginning of 2012?
Yeah, please.
So just to answer this question again, rather than predicting the future of what will happen if
it's
these
an example,
fractures,
it's not them specifically.
I will just analyze what happened before in different parts of Syria. I would talk about Northwest Syria example, where ISIS, when they first were introduced in the country, they were dominant in Northwest Syria. But then when the community there, they found out that ISIS will call for Imara, they pushed them to the east. The same happening now with Hayat Tahrir al-Sham in Idlib, because in the beginning when they were fighting the regime, yes, maybe the community, they accepted their presence, but then when they were trying to roll out the Sharia law and in extremist view, they try now to stand up and to not allow them to take the civil services. And there are many examples of like example, the Idlib Health Directorates, the Education Directorates, the local councils example in Northwest Syria, where they are not allowing these extremist group to rule the country. I think the same could apply for Eastern Ghouta in case these two fractures wanted to apply the Sharia law.
Okay. 30 days supposedly of a ceasefire, 5 hours a day in which people can get out. The question at the beginning was too little, too late. What do you think?
I would say that it's going to happen just like what happened in eastern Aleppo. It's not going to, because if you think of the pressure of 7-8 million people living in Damascus to get rid of this odd situation in eastern Ghouta that is shelling them on a daily basis.
So they move out and then the bombs continue to be dropped because then you've got the real targets in your sights.
The militants have to evacuate. This odd situation needs to end. I was in Damascus last year, these days, when somebody decided to cut the water off Damascus. We're talking about a community, an urban community of 7-8 million people. And the people of Damascus had to put up, I personally
let me ask
didn't have a shower for 8 days.
A question as we come towards the end of the programme. Do you believe President Assad has done anything to be ashamed of?
I'll tell you what.
A simple question.
Yeah, I will get to that.
No, don't get to it. Answer it now if you don't mind, please.
Well, I think he has a full support of a lot of people.
Has he done anything to be ashamed of?
I think everybody in this country, I might have done something, you probably have, I don't know, but a lot of people support President Assad because they are fearful for their existence, for their interests, and so on and so forth. I'd argue more than half of the Syrians supported the government in order to get this nightmare off their back. And they are increasingly doing as such. And to portray people of Ust and Ghouta as victims, well, victims of who? I would say they're hostages.
So many of them are victims.
I'd say they're hostages.
Whether they're hostages or not, they are victims, aren't they?
I'd say the responsibility of the Syrian government to free them
We do have to wrap this up pretty quickly.
Okay.
Bashar al-Assad is a vile person. He is a criminal of war, should be forwarded to the ICC soon. He caused the displacement of 14 million people. He caused the death of more than 500,000 people and the disability more than 2 million people. The destruction of infrastructure, more than 60% of the Syrian infrastructure and overstructure. He should be leaving soon and forwarded and be liable for his crimes.
Okay, appreciate it. The unfortunate thing is that we've been sitting around tables like this, in studios like this, around the world for 7 years now. I've probably done more programs about the conflict in Syria during the course of the last 7 years than any other subject. It's professional for me, it's very personal for a lot of you, and as we look at that picture of that young boy, brain damaged, they say, from a family that has lost 2 other children, we realise that there are very few people who will come out of this well. From me, David Foster, and the Roundtable team, thank you for watching.